do up we'll do minimally up to Chet and hopefully have time at the end to do some of the background sources, and then Sarah Bezat Hashem will do the Torah and Shulchan Aruch on that next week. But yeah, okay. So I think for like Hey through Chet / Dalet through Chet, most of the relevant background non-Torah Shulchan Aruch sources we've glanced at, especially the Gemara's last week when Joel taught. So I think like we're gonna review Dalet and we're gonna pick up in the Torah. So I'm just gonna like run through Dalet real quick because we touched on it at the end of Shir last week with Joel, but it leads directly into our Shir this week, right? So as we've seen, kind of the theme of this entire Siman is remember all of those rules we've been teaching you up until now. Well, actually, they only apply sometimes. And so aptly, a lot of these C themes start, but meds very memory, right? It's like it's the qualifying sort of phrase. So Dalet in the Torah starts with meds very memorim, right? All of these things that we've been saying about Bishul and the things that just said about like the Kli Rishon, the Kli Sheni, like Kavush Kmevushal, that was our first couple of Sifim. When does this apply? Kshenitarvu derech Bishul, kigon shenafal letoch hatavshil. Aval derech tzeli, kigon isor cham, or afilu kar, shenafal al tzeli, she'etzel ha'ish, eno oser kula, el kadei netila shu ka'ovi rochav etzba. When an isser falls on something that's being roasted, it doesn't forbid the entire thing. It only forbids it kadei netila, which again, to keep in mind, we have three main sort of measurements we're using. We have kadei klipa, which is like a thin little slice. We have kadei netila, which is like a bit of a thicker slice. And then we have kula. So there's a dispute actually amongst Seli as to whether we say, which of those we go with. The Torah goes by the Netila one, which is the Rashba's more chumridic take. B'pichach yirech shesalo begido uchatichat isor shetzla oim chatichat heter v'naguza b'zeh tzarich la'asir kedei netila saviv hagid v'chein min hachaticha b'makom shenaga b'chatichat isor. Therefore, again, if the thigh was roasted with the gid inside, or a bit of isser that was roasted with the permissible piece, and they touched, you just need to cut out a netila around the forbidden thing, right? This goes back to the Gemara that we learned with Joel last week, where they talk about like, yeah, if you roasted it, just like koleshu magia, just like keep eating and like slicing off until you get to the gid itself. They end up saying again, most Rishonim say lav dafka until you get to the thing itself. You have to leave a little room around it. So that's what he's saying here, right? The chenim nafal isor al chaticha shebekdera she chutz l'rotev v'lo ni'er hakdera v'lo kisauta eno oser ala kadei netila, right? So tseli lav dafka, right? We're using tseli as like a paradigm, right? Tseli as a thing that doesn't involve sauces and things being really easily distributed. So if you fall something that's in a pot, but there is not sauce / it's outside of the sauce, in that case, the same rules apply. Aval im hi barotev l'rashi kula l'ri afilu miksata kedeprishit la'ayil u'afilu kula chutz l'rotev v'ni'er u'keseh hakzera harotev mipapeh hatam u'ma'arvo v'nivla b'kulo. Right? If the thing it falls on is in the sauce, and this is a real throwback to, I don't know if we did this in the Gemara back, I think in like September, right? But there's the dispute between Rashi and the Ri as to how much a piece has to be in the sauce for whatever falls in that piece, the flavor to be spread around the entire pot, right? So Rashi thinks that like only if the entire piece is in the sauce does that flavor get spread. Right. And the Ri thinks even if part of it is in the sauce, it kind of all mixes, which I think we talked about this back when we did this months ago, but like can be either a chumrah or a kula, right? That like if it's something where the rest of the pot combining would like mean that there's shishim and the whole thing is batel and otherwise there isn't, then saying afilu miksata is the more makel position, right? That everything can combine. Whereas if it's like actually not a lot in the rotev / a big isser or whatever, then Rashi's position, which says, no, the only thing affected is that piece, unless it's entirely in the sauce, then you say, okay, well, that piece you cut off a chunk and the rest of it is fine unless it's completely submerged. But these are all of our different Selly and Selly adjacent scenarios. Okay. Now we're going to take a brief glance at the Beit Yosef where he says, Umidivre harambam, beperek tet vav. People give me a thumbs up when you have that. This is on Dalin.
Sorry, can
Could you say again where? What are we looking for?
It's the bolded umidivre, at least in the Shira in the Shira Devorah is the only thing that's bolded. It's within Dalet and the Beit Yosef.
The Beit Yosef
if you-
thing.
Yeah. Cool. Ruben, do you want to read?
I could give it a shot. I mean, I haven't read it before, so pardon if I make any mistake. So מדברי הרמב"ם פרק ט"ו, נראה שאין צריך נטילת מקום ולא קליפה. שאם הוא גדי שמן, שאין בו 60 כנגד החלב, כולו אסור. ואם יש בו 60 כנגד החלב, כולו מותר. וואי שנתבטל החלב בכולו. אילכך, אם נשאר שום חלב משליחו ואוכל הגדי, what's the one?
Hanemile.
והנמילה בחלב הכליות והקרב, וכיוצא בהם. אבל שומן נגיד וחוטים וקרומות האסורים, משום חלב, כמלן דאין מפעפעים. ילקח אוכל והולך, עד שמגיע לדבר אסור, ומשליחו. וכן כתב...
Or sorry, actually no, but maybe read the last bit since it's just setting it up.
וכן
I think
כתב...
that's,
האבן העזר? זה פרק זין...
I assume it's Harav HaMagid there.
yeah, the Magi Mishnah.
פרק זין, שזהו דעת הרמב"ם, שלא להצחיך קליפה לבהמה שנצלית עם חוטים וקרומות וגיד ושמנו בסמוך. ובסמוך יתברר דעת הרשב"א בדינים הללו.
Okay. So you don't need to translate word for word, but what is the Rambam's main position with when, and we'll obviously get into this in hay, but in general, when something is roasted and the fat is something that spreads, and versus when it's roasted and it's lean, not fatty.
So it's my first time reading it. If you give me like a couple minutes, I could actually tell you, but now if someone else could answer, it'd be great.
Aaron?
For fat that's mefafeh, the only relevant criterion is whether there's B-tool. If there is B-tool, it's fine. And if somehow there's like little chunks of fat left over, you just throw them out. You don't have to do anything extra. And if there's not B-tool, then the whole thing's aser. And then for these specific fats that aren't mefafeh, you just take them out. And it seems like you actually do not need to do ketei netila or even ketei klipa.
Right. The Rambam has the most kind of clear-cut divide. He's like, yes, if something does spread, then yeah, if there's shishim, it's completely batel. If there's not shishim, it's completely aser. And if it's not mefafeh, he says, he takes the Gemara at its word, right? Like ad shemagia legid, he's like, yeah, dafka ad shemagia legid, right? That like, you don't need to do kedei klipa, you don't need to do kedei netila. Like, yes, clear cut. Precisely. So he says, no, it's like, truly, if it's seli and it's like a lean, not spreading sort of iser, you don't need to leave sort of any amount. So that's the Rambam. Most people do not paskin like the Rambam. Obviously, right, we have typically, we talk about the Mechaber and how like his like trio of like the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. I don't know what the Rif is on this. Joel, did you see what the Rif was on? So I don't know. Well, also I don't know if the Rif explicitly paskins versus just includes the Gemara, in which case, you know, if there's ambiguity as to how the Rif goes, then often the Rosh gets a bit more of a say. And in this case, the Rosh and the Tosfot both say Kedei Tila, which definitely influences the Mechaber, as we'll see. Okay, do people feel good on Dalin? Great. So we're gonna move on to hay and get more into, or hay aleph, as we see the numbering on this Torah, at least in the Shira Devorah, is quite confusing. And we'll talk a bit more about this distinction between kachush, mepapeh, etc. Raphael, can you read Hey Aleph in the Torah?
Sure. בא דבורים אמורים, בירך עם גידו וחיו יצבו. דבר כחוש שאין בו כוח לפעפע בכל החתיכה, אבל גדי שמן שצלעו בחלב, אסור לאכול אפילו מראש אוזנו, כיוון שהוא שמן מפעפע בכולו. לא מבעיה חתיכה אחת שיש בה חלב שמפעפע לכולה, אלא אפילו חתיכת האיסור כחוש, וחתיכת יצר שנצלה עימה, שמינה האיסור מפעפע בכולו. Should I translate?
Yeah.
Like I don't know how you say it in English, but like moli chashmal, like it actually takes, it's able to convene the isur from one part to the other. When we're thinking about a yerech kachush, so we actually only localize the isur, but when we see and we have a gdi shamen, even mirosh ozno, a part that technically isn't that fatty, because you have like the fatty, like he's as a whole fat, the fat is part of the whole gdi, we can see even an isur coming from above, like from the point of his ear going down to the whole gdi.
I think the Filu Mirosha no part of it is just the idea of like it spreads to all directions, right? That there is no like kolefum, like it's just like if it's a fatty gedi, it goes everywhere, even to the tips of its ears, even if that's like upwards.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And this ikaron of piapua, this idea of piapua, can actually exist in a situation that the isur himself isn't shaman, but we're adding the isur shaman with a isur kachush and heter shaman. So the fattiness from the heter actually helps the isur bit go far away. Yeah.
Right. So
Convenient,
we'll spend a lot of time on that scenario because it we'll have different strong feelings about the case of the kachush isur and the shaman heter. But for now, let's take a look. So also for people who have this year at Devorah, it's kind of confusing. The chet is interposed between Hey Aleph and Hey Bet that Raphael just read, but yeah. So Raphael, could you pick up in the Beit Yosef on Hey Aleph? At first, he just quotes our Gemara that we learned last week, but could you pick up with on? It starts with Viharan Katav Shehara'a. I don't know how to reference that for people who are in different editions, but it's after he cites in parentheses like Lamed Daled Dibar Matchel Gadi Shetzla'o.
Yes, I found it. Like just after Rabbi Yochanan.
Exactly.
And then there's a quote. Everyone found it? אוקיי, ורן כתב שהרעה חולק בזה, ואמר, דאין חלב מפעפע מתבטל בצלי לעולם, דקדירה הוא שמתבטל מפני שהרוטב מוליך האיסור. בשווה, אבל בצלי שהוא מפעפע מעצמו, אפשר שהרבה ממנו מתכנס במקום אחד, לכך אפילו בשישים לא בטיל. נראה מלבד שהוא חולק עליו. וגם גדול הפויסקים חולקים עליו.
All right, so translator summarize.
Yeah, so the Ra'ah points that Shuman isn't actually that similar to Rotev. The idea of that Rotev, this fluid, can actually like take the Isur all around a substance. It doesn't work that well with Shuman in a Tzali, that you don't actually have anything outside the Isur or outside like the things we're actually talking about, the Chatichot, to take it around. Quite the opposite. You can find a situation, we can imagine it, that the fattiness actually like I don't know, nikva lemakom echad, actually like is very in a very small.
It's not like bishaveh, right? It's what he says. It's like we think that even if it's mapapeh, he's like mapapeh is not the same as like what we're talking about with rotev, right? And we're talking about mebushal and everything's all like mixed together or whatever. We truly think that there's like some relatively even dispersal of the flavor, right? But he's like, just when we're saying the papaya, that means it spreads. That means it doesn't stay in one place. That doesn't mean it actually like equally dispersed throughout the entire thing. So the ra is also, the ra is a dat hayatid. Also, just who the ra is in this commenting on who?
He's
Clumpy is a good
commenting on
word.
Torah Tabayit Larashba.
Exactly. Yeah. This is him in the Beta Kabayit, not to be confused with the Beta Yosef's Beta Kabayit on himself. This is the Ra'ah's commentary on the Rashba. Yeah. So as the Beit Yosef just pointed out, nobody ends up poskening like the Ra'ah, which is convenient because that would be a very chomerdik psak. But it is a really interesting point, right? Like I do think it actually is like a very interesting observation about the physical reality, that there is a big difference between how things spread when you have like a sauce versus saying like fat that kind of moves around a lot, but we don't know exactly what that looks like.
Right,
Correct.
can you say anything positive, not positive, impactful about mefapea? You know, when you compare it to what you're comparing it, it seems less. The mefapea seems pretty persistent. Even if
What do
we
you mean by
don't know where it
persistent?
goes. What?
What do you mean by persistent?
It's mefapea. It goes and it goes. You know, it doesn't seem to have any closure. Therefore, it's always a danger. Or you don't see it that way.
No, I mean, I think the idea of mifapea is always a danger. I mean, I think that ends up sort of rearing its head when we get into the psak of the Pagochere Dora and whatever that like the Ramah picks up, where we say we never know if something's mifapea, it always could be, right? So I think the idea that something could spread, the idea that's always something you have to be concerned about, does come up in the psak. I think the Ra'ah specific notion that like mifapea is something that's so concerning, not only because it might happen, but because even if it does happen, it won't be even, and thus everything would be totally usher, is not something we see throughout most of the other post game. Joel, did you have something to say?
No, I maybe this is clear and I'm just tired, but I think this is the Ra'ah's point is powerful in the sense that he's in what he's not agreeing with is what he's pointing out is when does Sli turn into Bishul, and can you ever make that comparison? And I think this is where I think Rav Lan is, is this whole question of is mefafea like Bishul, or is mefafea something really scary where it's like the stuff never gets batel, it's like always just moving around the substance and you never have a clue where it actually is. Because it doesn't spread out in some even predictable way. So in that sense, could be very scary, even though we reject the Ra. So,
well, if that's the case, I'll just write it down my classifications of the various scary parts of Yoreh Deah. It's not the demon. Well, they lead towards the dark side, the demonic. You never know when it's going to reach out and grab you, because it's mefapea. Okay, I'm done.
There you go. Well, a spooky twist. Okay. So I want us to look a little bit in the Beit Yosef and under the next chunk, right, where he says V'harash b'katav b'Torah tabayit. Again, some of this is repetitive. I want us to look at where he says U'b'Torah tabayit hakatzar. You'll see there's like, this is about halfway through that Dibur Matzriel, as parentheses afterwards that say Sham, so Ein Amud Aleph. People, yeah.
Can you
Thumbs
say it
up
one
when
more
you
time,
got it.
Lexie? And then,
Yeah. Also, wait, Alan, did you have your hand up? Did you have something you wanted to add?
nothing substantive.
Okay, so we're reading B'Torah tabayit hakatzar. Yavni, can you read?
Sure. ובתורת הבית הקצר כתב בלשון קצר וצח, החלב והשומן מפעפין, ולכן אפילו על ידי צלי, אפילו על ידי מליחה, אוסרים את הכל, עד שיהיה בהיתר 60 כנגד כל האיסור. So this is it. Even like normally we were for us to be worried about things infecting whole things, we require bishul, but with fat, because it has this property of being mefafea, even with tzeli and even with salting, even with roasting and even with salting, we assume that it spreads enough to us or everything. unless there's 60 against it. לפיכך, כדי שמן שצלעו בחלבו, אם אין בכל הגדי 60 כנגד כל החלב שבו, אסור לאכול אפילו מראש אוזנו, שהחלב מפעפע בכל. Therefore, our example of a goat that you roasted without removing its fat, with the fat still in it, if you don't have 60 of the goat against all of the fat that was in it, then you're not allowed to eat any part of it, because the fat spreads out. במה דברים אומרים? בגדי שמן, אבל בכחוש, אף על פי שאין בגדי 60 כנגד כל החלב שבו, אינו אסור אלא כדי קליפה. שהחלב של בהמה כחושה, כחוש הוא בטבעו, ואינו מפעפע. And this is for the case of a fat goat, but a lean goat, we only need a lean goat that doesn't have, even if it doesn't have 60 against the fat in it, it's only a sul kedei klipa, like you only have to take out the fat that's there and a klipa around it, because a lean animal has lean fat, and the characteristic of lean fat is that it doesn't spread out.
Right. So I think this is something I wanted to just like point out. Because remember the first time that I learned this, the first time I learned that Gemara, right, where it talks about like b'gedi kachush, my assumption was like, yes, the relevance is that like a lean animal has less fat, right? Which like I do think is probably the intuitive reading of how we generally refer to kachush. It just means that there is less fat on it, not that the fat that exists is somehow fundamentally different in nature. But my assumption is like most of the like Mefarshim do end up explaining it as that it's like kachush b'tiv'o. I'm assuming it's because if we said that the distinction of kachush is actually just that, oh, there's less fat, then it's like, okay, well, there's less fat, but there's still some reasonable amount of fat, and you should still need 60 times that amount of fat, right? Because shouldn't that fat, if it's of the same nature as other fats, still be mifafea and able to spread? Who cares if there's less of it? It should be able to spread in the same way as a larger quantity of fat, right? So to say if there's something different, we have to actually say there's something different about the nature of the fat of skinny animals, which I don't know enough. Alan?
Yeah, this actually makes sense. I mean, it's like the difference between eating like a chicken breast and like lean meat in my non-vegetarian days, or like if I'm going for a run and I've got a little bit of a little bit more portly these days, but I bounce around a little bit more. But if I have like a six pack, it's all like staying very hard in place. It's more dense.
When talking about meat, people tend to like talk about marbling, meaning this how much fatty the animal is, not only in like he has chunks of fat, but like a good animal, like a well-fed, they tend to like to have a fat spread inside their muscle. You know, like people know about Wagyu beef, people talk that it's a very well marbled beef. It has fat that actually is mefapeh b'chulo. It's like a very mefapeh.
Wait, but when we say mefapeh, that's an impact of the heat that's applied. It's
Correct.
not.
No, sure. I was only.
No. I mean, because when you say like, oh, Wagyu beef, the thing with Wagyu beef is like, yes, it has this high fat content that's marbled, but you can also have a cow that just, like you say, has chunks of fat, and you would think those have different impacts. And it seems like in this case, when we're talking about fatty like animals, like, yeah, they could be marbled, but it's also just as bad if you have these chunks of fat because they're going to distribute unevenly. Pardon me.
Can I ask a basic question? Which fat is the forbidden fat and which fat is the permitted fat? Like what's the shuman? Like I assume that marbling is the shuman that's allowed. Otherwise, we'd have more problems. No. Does anyone know?
It is no. It is mutal, but technically because we see fat as like this one substance, so chelev and shuman, like they they transpone from one to the other. So we see this issue like going around technically.
Joel?
Well, I just two things, right? Because the chelev, assuming we haven't cooked it yet, right? Is in particular locations, so it's easy to remove. I don't know, easy to remove, but it's easier to remove, right? It's not like you have to be searching around. But we also could have like a shuman animal, right? Because we have an animal that has shuman that's not kosher that touches up that's sully with a kosher piece of beef or whatever, something like that, which would also be a problem. So.
Right. So we have both the unkosher like chelev within a kosher animal, and then we have the cases, right, of just like any of the fats within a non-kosher animal slash treif, like nevela, etc. Yeah, personally, as somebody who has never cooked meat before, I can't say that I'm like super expert as to the realities of how these work. Personally, the idea of kachosh b'tivo didn't make a lot of sense to me vis-a-vis like the realia, but again, I can't say that I am Bucky in the physical aspects of it. But again, you can understand what motivates that explanation, right? Because otherwise, the kachush, as in it just has less fat, wouldn't seem to result in the psak of you only need a klipa. It would seem to say you just still need shishim times that lesser amount of fat. Reuven?
I mean, the way I understood it is that it's like it would be similar to water. Like imagine you have like a pot of water that's like that holds, I don't know, 2 liters of water. And then like you have another one that has like 500 milliliters, right? I'm sorry, I'm being Canadian here with the measurements. Like when you have less water, like the chances are that it's not going to go as deep, right? When you pour it onto something, like things are not going to get as wet, right? So same thing with the shuman to a certain extent, right? It doesn't go as deep into the tzili because there isn't as much shuman, and that's the way I understood it.
I
Like
think that would,
it doesn't spread as much just because there isn't as much shuman.
I think in this case, there would have to be 2 different kinds of water. It would be water and heavy water or something, but that there's
No, but
something
I'm saying that-
chemically. It's not just in terms of different amounts. He's saying that the chemical or the material composition of these things is different, not just because of the amount of them.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, that's not, at least that's not how I understood it. We're talking about like the
Yeah,
same
I think
kind
that
of.
is.
I think that is the nature of the b'tiv o, right? That's the logic of the b'tiv o
Right.
explanation, again, as opposed to the other kachush one. The b'tiv o is that there's actually something different about the very like
Like the very nature of
chemical
it.
composition and nature of the fat in a lean animal.
So
And that we're
there's,
saying
two
that
different types of like 2 different type of animals in a way.
we're saying that according to this explanation, a fatty animal's fat is mipapea, and a skinny animal's fat is skinny fat that is not mipapea. Again, I think we're gonna pause on the discussion now just because there's a lot more to cover. But yeah, whether or not you buy that explanation as it maps onto our reality does appear to be how most people explain it, because again, as we've articulated, otherwise it leaves us with a bit of a confusing psak. So Yavni, can you continue reading from the V'yesh Omrim?
ויש אומרים שצריך נטילת מקום, והראשון נראה לי עיקר, אלא שיש לחוש. And there are those who say that, so for the case of the kachush animal and kachush fat, where you just need to take out the fat, there are those who say that you also need to take out a netilat makom around the fat. And the Rashba thinks that the Karadin, you don't need to take netilat makom, and but it's good to, but we should be careful and be machmir.
Right. Okay. So he's like, really, I think Mikradin, as you said, like we only need a klipa, but like also I think ultimately like the difference between netilat makom and klipa, I mean, I guess it depends on how much meat you're dealing with, but it's not like a massive difference, right? Like netilat makom presumably still leaves you with a decent amount of food, hopefully. So it's not like a crazy chumrah. If you're like, some people hold this way, it's not a huge loss to go like that versus k'dei klipa, then maybe we should yesh lachush. I'm going to quickly, if we look in the Bach, you see the Bach on the Katav HaRashba on the same page. Just that he's going to add another important point from the Rashba that gets codified about when we have the Pateya and when we have Shishim. So the Katav HaRashba b'Torah Tabayit Haruch. Rav
Lexie, is this the Bach or the Beit Yosef?
Sorry, this is the Beit Yosef. That is it.
Okay.
Yes. Apologies.
No,
the Beit Yosef on the other side of the page. Right. So the Katav HaRashba b'Torah Tabayit Haruch. והווה יודע שכל דבר שיש לו פירפות שנפל למקום ידוע מן החתיכה, שאף על פי שיש בחתיכה לבטל האיסור, צריך ליטול מקומו, וכמו שאמרו בפרק כיצד סולין, נטף מרוץ בו על החרס וחזר אליו ייטול את מקומו. So he says, in the case where there's a fact that it's like mapapea that spreads, and there is shishim to batel it, you still also should do netilat makom from the place where the fat originated, right? And the idea, the initial netilat makom source comes from this bit in Hilchot Pesach, this whole source that I think we didn't look at, but it talks about when the thing returns and you have to yitol it mikomo. That's kind of the source in the Gemara for this principle. ובקצר כתב כלשון הזה, כל איסור מפעפע, חם שנפל על גבי התר חם, אף על פי שיש בהתר 60 לבטלו, צריך ליטול ממקום שנפל שם האיסור קליפה עבה ביותר. ונקרא בכל מקום נטילת מקום. Right, the idea is basically that unlike the Ra'ah, Isaac, we're in the Katav Harashba in Beit Yosef.
Thank you.
On right, so we're not going to the extent of the Ra'ah to be like, actually, Kippua is so uneven that the whole thing is definitely usher. But it's kind of this intermediate point of being like, yes, we do think that when something is mafafea, it generally can be pretty evenly distributed throughout the rest of the piece. But we still think there's a little bit more concentration in the area that it originated, such that you want to like cut that chunk off. Right, that we think mostly through the rest of it, it's distributed pretty well. But like in that little area, we don't think it's left it as much, right? That we think there's a bit more concentration than there is with Bishul, even for the non-Ra'ah opinion. Going back to our whole spooky Yipua concept. Okay. Do people feel good up to here? Okay. Last one around ground zero. Here you go. Okay, so now we're gonna take a bit of a look at the Beit Yosef on the Lomi Baya, right? This was the other half of Hay that Raphael read. And this was where the Torah said, right, obviously like one chaticha that has like this chelev mepapea, again, you need the shishim in that piece. But even if you have isur kachush and chatichat heter shamin, right? In that case, we still are worried about the spreading throughout the entirety. So Jess, would you be able to read in the Beit Yosef, in the Onhei Bet, Imashakatav Lomi Baya?
I think I'm not the best person today, if that's okay. I'm quite jet lagged.
No worries. Michael, could you read the Lomi Baya in the Beit Yosef?
Yeah. מה שכתב לא מבעיה חתיכה אחת שיש בה חלב שמפעפע בכולה, אלא אפילו חתיכת האיסור כחוש וכולי. נראה שטעמו משום שנמחה קצת השומן ונבלע בחתיכת האיסור, חזר השומן ההוא חתיכת נבלה, וכשהוא נבלע אחר כך בחתיכת ההתר הוא מפעפע. ולפי זה, לדידן, דנתינן כרבנו אפרים, דאין חתיכה עצמה נעשית נבלה, אלא בבשר בחלב, כמו שכתבתי בסימן צדי ב'. אף על פי שחתיכת ההתר שמן עם חתיכת האיסור כחוש, Share.
Okay. So let's go up to there. So translator summarize up to there.
Okay. Right, it appears that the reasoning for this is that the fat spreads and is absorbed in the Chatichat Isur and then returns right, that it right, it is kind of absorbed, and when it is when it is like reabsorbed after that into the chatichat haheter, like the permitted one, that it spreads out, and it's for this reason that it's kind of that we have the statement in accordance with Rabbeinu Ephraim.
Well, no, so he says up to there, he's explaining at first the Beit Yosef is like, it seems like the physical logistics of this with when we have the fatty heter and the kachush iser is that the reason we have to worry about like piapua about like, you know, being usher the entire thing is that basically the fattiness will like seep from the heter to the iser. The fat that went over there will become usher. And then that fat, which as we know, it's the very nature of that fat that it's mefafea, not about the amount, that fat will come back to the heter. And now it's been like naset nevela, right? Because the bits of heter fat that came over to the kachush piece, the kachush iser, have become usher.
Right.
That fat comes back to the iser and spreads throughout the whole, to the heter, and spreads throughout the whole thing, makes the whole thing forbidden if there isn't shishim. So he's saying, at first he's like, that must be what the logistics are here, which means that with Deah, according to us, then.
Well, if he's at, right, and according to this, for us that we are kind of using this example that's given with Rabbeinu Ephraim.
Well, that's here, like we hold like Rabbeinu Ephraim.
We hold like Rabbeinu Ephraim, that the chaticha itself, that's right, or the chaticha itself is not turned into an avela, right, except for in cases with basar v'chalav, as we had earlier in Tzadibat, right. Even though, right, and even though the piece that's chatichat heter, right, like that is fattier, is in the same, is like combined, not combining, but like together with the leaner one, that it's permitted.
Right, that he's saying if the thing that's happening here is premised on like fat from the fatty heter going over to the nevela, being naset nevela, and then coming back to the heter and spreading, if that's the concern with heter shmena, we who don't hold chatichat manas nevela except in basar b'chalav wouldn't say this is a problem, right? If that was the sort of logistics of what's occurring here, the only case in which we have to worry about piapua would be when the isser itself is fatty. But he's going to give an alternative explanation, right? Because the Torah also doesn't hold chatichat nezet nevela outside of basar b'chalav, and he just recorded this din, right? So that can't be it, right? So aval ani misupak.
Aval ani misupak im hadin kain shehare afshar sheta'amo shel Rabbeinu hu mida amar Rav beperek ketzad solim. De'afilu basar shchuta shamen uvasar nevela kachush de'azil basar shchuta umifatem levasar nevela kachush v'hadar le basar nevela umifatem le bereiche levasar shchuta ve'im bereiche anu omrim kach kol sheken sheyesh lomar kach b'tzali. Ve'od echtov bazeh b'sof hasiman b'seif dal.
B'siyata d'shmaya.
B'siyata d'shmaya.
All right.
We're past that already. Okay. Okay. Right, but I kind of have concluded differently regarding this ruling, that it's possible that the reasoning for the tour is that that which Rab says in in Parakate Sad Salim, right? That even in a case where you have shafted meat and that's fatty, and nevela meat that is lean, and that the fatty shafted meat goes and like spread
Like perfumes.
like, right, like kind of exudes, right, like perfume, like
Yeah.
perfumes the nevela meat that is that's lean, and then the nevela meat, the lean nevela meat kind of comes back and perfumes it with its fumes. Right, that like that kind of exchange is a possibility in general. Right, like if we're going to say that that's a possibility for scent, like all the more so that we should say it's a possibility when it comes to like these things actually touching.
Right, which I don't know that I agree with that logic, and we'll see some others think that actually the only concern here, Dafka, would be scent. But that's again, like we haven't actually gotten deeply into Recha Milta, but we do end up, well, actually, yeah, it's a dispute as to whether we hold Recha Milta, whether like smell is a significant thing that can make things usser, right? But in one of those sugyas, as you just read, like there's this whole idea of like fatty permitted thing, lean thing, and there's whole like back and forth of like the fatty thing has enough smell that it goes to the like nevela, picks up the nevela scent in its fatty perfume, and then wafts that back to the heter, and then that recha can be a problem. So he's saying, yeah, we saw, I guess, this kind of example with recha. So I guess maybe something, at the very least, something akin to that can occur in this scenario. So that maybe that's the logic, and it's not specifically, the whole like naset nevela mechanism that we're dealing with here. Okay, I'm gonna
Okay.
just,
Can I ask a question?
yeah,
I'm not sure. I'm wondering about the we're translating in this context. Pitum seems to be like perfuming seems to be the like a good translation, but in general, pitum seems to have more to do with it, more to do with like the substance of fat also, like when we say like fattening up an animal in order is also called lifatem, which doesn't have anything to do with fragrance.
correct. Yeah, no, like pitum does generally have to do with like, yeah, it's like the way of, we talk about the in Mayadidus as well, we talk about the right, so hutamim. But I do think here in the Recha Milta scenario, I think it basically is the idea of like, it's connected to fat in the sense that the assumption is that fatty things are able to like produce and share fragrance, right? But the mifatim does basically like, it imparts its fatty scent and then picks that up and like brings it back. Rav Joel?
I always understood that kind of the way Yavin tuned it is that it changes the nature, like the recha changes the kachush thing into having the teva of effect. This was, I think, where maybe Rav Landis was suggesting earlier almost. Maybe when we get to recha milta, we can get back into it. But like this idea of that, like this like fatty stuff is so dangerous that it can like just in the air cause the things around it to become fat. It infects them with being the quality of being fatty. But
Very possible. Aaron?
This sort of situation seems intuitively, you wouldn't want to say this would be fine. If the Torah, since the Torah holds Hanan, seems likely that the reason he thinks this is not fine is Hanan, but the Beit Yosef is looking perhaps for a way.
The Torah doesn't hold Hanan.
Sorry. Right, sorry. Meaning that just perhaps the Beit, if we don't hold Hanan, that the situation is actually not a problem. The Torah the Beit Yosef seems intuitively bothered by it and is perhaps looking for a reason to make it also. Recha is the closest thing he can think of, but that he's trying to find a way to make this aser even if we don't hold Hanan.
For sure, as in like he seems, because Dafka the Torah doesn't hold Hanan B'Shari Sorim, but he just like wrote this din stam, the implication is that the Torah does hold this way, right? And so if he doesn't hold Chadam Bashari Sarin, there must be another mechanism at work here, right? So part of what inspires the citing the Reichel Milta scenario, which also, again, is not a bad comparison, given it is another scenario where we see specifically this idea of the Heter Shmena and the Isser Kachush and how those interact and can make one another usher. Rav Landis?
Yeah, well, first of all, Joel, when you said that fatty thing, you referenced me. I didn't get, were you referencing me? Oh, what I said. Okay, but we're always drawing a line, not drawing, we're always like, abstract halacha, cold halacha, what, the rules. And Reicha, but I know we're not the Reicha Milta yet, but the smell of something that is shaman cooking is such an empirical deal, really hard to dismiss it. And especially if in the mind you're worried that it's really coming from that which is usher, that's a major assault.
No, I think there's a big reality to that, though, right? Like when you can't actually, when there is something that is very potent smelling and you couldn't really fully distinguish between the smell coming from the heter and the Isser, it makes sense that you would kind of combine them in a way. But that's for another time. We do Reicha Milta. For now, we press on. I'm going to briefly read again for those who have at least this the edition of the Shira Devora. The Chet is weirdly sandwiched between Hey Aleph and Hey Bet. That's about the Kulia. We're not going to get super deep into the Kulia this thing, but I'm just going to read it, right? So Kulia shel tla'ah b'chalva eno asor ela kedei klipa shehakrom mafsik. Right, so if you recall back in the Gemara about the kolefu magia, the kolefu ve'ochel ad shemagia lagid, etc., we gave the distinctions, right, in the cases of. So I just read Reuben Chet in the Torah about the kulia, right? So the two different answers were something about the animal being kachush, and that's when it's not oser, up until its ears. And the other was, it was referring specifically to the case of like this kidney, where there's this sort of membrane that is like mafsik, right? That prevents the fat from being absorbed from the entire thing. And so the Torah seems just like paskin from this straightforwardly that like with the kulia, again, it's not usher in that scenario. We'll see. Not everyone does in fact paskin like that. Not everyone accepts that the Gemara accepts that terus. But we'll see that in the Shulchan Aruch. Finally, we're going to look in the Torah at Zayin, which again might be in different places in different editions. In my edition, Zayin comes after there's Yud Gimel, then there's Tet Bet, and then there's Zayin. It's on Resh Tzadi Zayin in the Shira Devorah. So give me a thumbs up when you've got Zayin in the Torah. Alan, do you want to read?
Sure. No, so
that's V'chein Malach is Yud Gimel. V'had Chatichat Yisor.
Which letter did you want? Sorry.
Zayin.
You wanted Zayin.
So it's at the bottom of Resh Tzadizim.
Okay, I got it. Sorry. The Chatichat Yisor Oseret Saverta Negiata Davka She'Isra Mechmat Atzma. Kigun Nevela O Basar B'Chala. Aval in Embab Yisor Ela Masha Bal'am Im Kam Acher in Oseret Acheret Hanagatbo. Good. Yeah. נצלה ביחד שאין דבר הבלוע בחתיכה יוצא ממנה לבלה באחרות אלא על ידי רוטב אפילו החתיכה של התר שמנה לשומן שבה מפעפע לפי שאין השומן שבה מוליך עמו האיסור אלא למקום שהאיסור יכול ללך בטבעו. Okay, so when we were talking earlier about this piece of Isser making the one next to it, Asr by touching it, we were talking about a case in which the thing has an essence of Isser. It could be Nevela, it could be a Basar B'chalav mixture. But if that's not the case, if it's just something that is like absorbed in Isser from somewhere else, it's not going to be able to Osir something that's touching it, even if they're roasted together, because it just doesn't have that power to convey Isser except through rotative.
Right, even
Yeah. Even if it's a fatty piece of pater and the oil in it is spreading all over the place, the oil can't carry along with it Isser, only in the place that the Isser goes by its nature.
right. That basically we say since the Isser that is absorbed in right the piece that is now Usser, right, that is Usser because it absorbed Isser. Since the Isser absorbed in that does not have the power to spread to the Chatichat Heter, even though the Chatichat Heter has all this fun popping around fat that could like spread it, we say that like, you know, in this case, it is not able to the, you know, other piece of Isser, the Kachush Isser with the that has become like forbidden from absorbed forbidden taste, not that it is forbidden in of itself, doesn't spread to the Heter. The Beit Yosef is disturbed by this because he sees this as an inconsistency in the Torah. So who hasn't read today? Andres, do you want to read in the Beit Yosef on this? Let's see. Yeah, picking up it, right, the Beit Yosef on Zayin, the Hara Chatichat Isor Oseret Chaveretza B'Nikiata.
Yes, just in a second. Okay, yeah. כך כתב הרשב"א בתורת הבית, וזה לשונו, חתיכה שנאסרה מחמת שקיבלה טעם ממקום אחר, אינה אוסרת חברותיה, אף על פי שנוגעת בהם כששתיהן חמות, ואפילו ניצלו שתיהן כאחת ונוגעות זו בזו, בשעת שאין על גב האש, שהדבר הבלוע אינו יוצא מחתיכת לחתיכת, אלא על ידי רוטב. שאם אין אתה אומר...
שאם אי אתה אומר כן.
שאם אין, אוקיי, אתה אומר כן, אין לך קליפה, שהקליפה אוסרת קליפה סמוכה, אלא, וכן לעולם.
Okay.
So he's quoting now this is all the Rashba?
Right, so yeah, this is the Rashba on Torah to Bite.
I think isn't he just repeating what the Rosh said?
So mostly he's mostly repeating, like most of this is what we just saw in the Torah. I think there's a really like the sort of fun point that the Rashba makes is this bit about the klipa, right? That if we don't say that like Isser Balua can't just keep going and going, he's like, how would you ever have the idea of something that's only Oser Kadei Klipa, right? Once that's been Oser Kadei Klipa, once the Isser has spread to that Klipa, why is that Klipa not able to then Usser the Klipa next to it? And then that one, the Klipa next to it, right? Like if we said that actually an Isser Balua can then easily just keep Ussering the thing next to it, you would just never have the idea of only part of a thing being forbidden. It would just keep spreading ad infinitum, right? So he's like, that's why we must say there's this sort of tzav, there's this limit to how far the Isser Balua can go.
I don't know if this is too confusing, but it feels a little bit like it's a kli sheni or like a like not an av tuma, like this like secondary reception of the bad stuff that can't keep passing it on indefinitely.
No, I think it's a reasonable comparison. The idea that again, like things just lose the further they go from their source, the less power they have to spread more to other things. Okay, but then this is really the crucial part in this Beit Yosef. Skip a line or two where you say after the period is v'yesh litmoa al dvarim elu.
ויש לתמוה על דברים אלו שהם סותרים. למה שכתב לעיל,
למה?
למה שכתב לעיל, אפילו חתיכת האיסור כחושה, וחתיכת האיסור שניצלה עימה, שמנה, האיסור מפעפע בכולו. וכאן כתב שאין השומן שבה מוליך עמו האיסור, אלא במקום שהאיסור יכול לילך בטבעו. אבל לא קשה לי ממה שכתב קודם לכן בחתיכת
Actually, yeah, pause up to there. The seer thing is related, but a bit of a tangent.
Okay, so why is this surprising? If you have two pieces, one is that there is kachush and one that is shamen, the isur goes everywhere, mefafea everywhere. Then what is he saying afterwards?
Right, so he's raising what he sees as a stira, a contradiction between the deen that we just talked about earlier. Remember when we brought up the whole case of Recha Milta versus Naset Nevela, right? That vis-a-vis when you have a Chatichat Isur Kachush and a Chatichat Heter Shamin, right? That we say if they like touch one another, that the ends up like spreading throughout the entirety of the heter, right? Whereas here he's saying in the case of an Isser Balua, and then there's a heter shamin, it doesn't spread throughout the entirety of the heter, right? And the Beit Yosef sees this as a contradiction. He's like, okay, in one scenario, you said a fatty heter could take Isser and spread it. And in this scenario, you're saying that can't happen. So what's the deal? Obviously, various people will have potential answers to this. So I think I'm going to real quick read, we're going to look in the Darchei Moshe and briefly at the Bach, and I think we'll take a 5-minute break and pick up in the Shulchan Aruch. So let's look at the Darchei Moshe Yud Tet. So he says, V'li nira, dulo kasha midi. This is not difficult at all. לגבי חרב שטבעו שהוא מפרפע, אלא שאינו מפרפע כשהוא כחוש, על כן כשהתר שמן בקל אבי דחלף הכחוש מפרפע ולקח אסור לעיל, שהאיסור בעצמו מפרפע. למרחוק על ידי קצת שומן שקיבל מן ההתר. אבל בשאר איסורים שאין מפרפעים בטבען, אין השומן של התר מוליך עמו האיסור, אלא במקום שהאיסור יכול ללך לשם. So the way that Darchei Moshe sees it, he's like, okay, the difference is that in our earlier scenario, we were dealing with like ultimately an isser of chelet, right? It was an isser of fat, seemingly, but it's just that it was fat of a lean animal, which, as we know, in its very nature is lean and doesn't spread so easily. But since generally it is part of fat's nature to spread, it's easy once that fat comes into contact with basically some fattier fat. It is easier for it to spread, right? Whereas this Isser Balua that is not even a fatty Isser, right? Which he assumes we're dealing with here, due to the follow-up that we have, the Chaver Ashba. In this case, when it's not even an Isser that is at all in its nature fatty, or there's no piafur related to it whatsoever, then the fatty heter doesn't have the capacity to spread this Isser everywhere. I feel medium about the Darchei Moshe teretz. I don't know. Like I think there's some logic to it. I think it works sort of and not entirely, is my feeling. Other people have strong thoughts on the Darchei Moshe. Yavni?
He doesn't quite say this, but it almost seems like he could be saying because like oil-based things and water-based things don't mix, that the oil-based heter, the like fatty shuman can take the isul kachush, even the chelev asur, even though it's kachush, because oils mix. Whereas like if it's isul balua that's water-based, then it won't mix and be carried by the, I don't know.
That's really smart. I like that. You made me like the Darchei Moshe's teretz a little more. Okay, we're gonna glance at the Bach. So the Bach U'Ma Shekatav Rabbeinu Aval Ein Ba Isor. So he's also going to reference the Beit Yosef. Tama alav Beit Yosef v'katav shehem sotrim l'ma shekatav ba'ayil afilu chatichat ha'isor chusha v'chulei ad kam nashono v'lo kashya v'lo midei. This is again, the Bach also thinks this is in fact not difficult. The Isor Asur Mechamat Atzmo Ka'amar Rabbeinu Ba'ayil. The Filo HaIsor Kachush, HaHeter Shehu Shamen, Molichimo HaIsor She'etzlo. Aval Kshe'en HaIsor Mechamat Atzmo, Ele Shebala Isor Makom Acher, Zo Kamar Rabbeinu Afal Pi She'ota Chaticha Shebalat HaIsor Yishmeina. Ein HaShomen Molichat HaIsor Shebo, Imo Lechaticha Acheret Below Rotev. כיוון שאיסור הנבלע אינו מפרפע מעצמו. אבל כשהחתיכה אסורה מחמת עצמה, אפילו היא כחושה מכל מקום, מאחר זה בעל כורחה פולטת רוטב נבלה, יוקח אם ההתר אצלו שמן, השמן מתערב ברוטב נבלה, ונבלע עמו בחתיכה, ותות מפתם בשר נבלה משומן השקוטה, ואחר כך נבלע ההתר, ודבר פשוט שכך היא דת רבנו. One of my favorite things I'll say about the Bach is that he'll often address something that is in fact very complicated and be like, this is extremely pashut. I don't know why anyone else had a difficulty with it. But so the Bach, I think, has a sort of similar parish to the Darchei Moshe, but a bit different. His main thing is that he points out the, in fact, very clear distinction. Whether or not you think this is a meaningful distinction, you can challenge the Bach on, but the clear distinction between these two cases, right, is that in one we're dealing with when there is a thing that is itself aser, like a piece of nevela, for example, that is kachush, and the heter shamen. And he's saying that that's different than when you have a piece that has been ne'asar from something that it absorbed that is aser, and a heter shamen, right? And he's saying the difference is like when the thing is nevela mitzad atzmo, it is leaking like fully nevela juices, right? Like everything coming out from it is fully aser, which is different than something that has been ne'asar, but only essentially a bit of the actual iser is what's being pulled, right? That he says essentially the whole interaction that we've been imagining and what's happening with the Shmena Heter is different when the thing it's kind of seizing from the iser piece is like iser itself versus the plita or something that itself absorbed iser, right? Which I do think that there is something intuitive about that distinction. I think mamashut versus tam, I think is a good point, right? That like when we have the thing that is nesar, right? What it's exuding is actually like something that only actually has maybe 1/55 of iser, right? Of like the actual iser in it, as opposed to no, this is just like nevela juice or scent coming out. Okay. Real quick, we're going to look at the end of Zayin, which is the Katav HaRashba, and then we'll break.
Lexie, quoting Yavni, you said Mamashut and Tam, and then you talked about the amount of the Isur. Is it also a authority issue, that which is authentic or original, and that which is derivative?
I do think that is part of the idea of this entire principle that we see, right? Of the like right? The idea that like, yeah, there's only, I think this goes both to the authority and back to like this whole concept of how far do we take something from its makor, right? Like what does it mean to say, okay, this thing that is usher but is not so fatty is interacting with a fatty heter, and then that versus, okay, Isser spread to this thing, it absorbed that, and then this isn't that fatty, but then this thing that absorbed the Isser is interacting with a fatty piece of heter, and that like, I think part of it is how far do we consider almost like the kutis of the Isser to extend. Okay, so reading the last bit of Zayin in the Torah, we have the Katav HaRashba. We have our like third or fourth Medvarim Amorim of the last hour. The Medvarim Amorim, Yeshabalat Yisor She'enu Mepapeh, אבל בלע מן הדברים המפתים בטבען, כגון שומן, אוסרת חברתה בין בצלי בין נוגע זו בזו חום בחום, שהאיסור הבלוע בעצמו מפתח ויוצא מחתיכה לחתיכה. Right? So this only applies to when the absorbed isser is that thing that was absorbed is not the kind of thing that spreads around, right? But when the isser itself that was absorbed is something that spreads, then we think it continues to be able to spread, right? The idea is the difference between, like a fatty or thin piece of heter meat absorbed not mipapeh isser, and then that touched something else, versus heter meat absorbed a spreading around kind of isser and then touched something else. In that case, we say the isser continues to be able to spread. And with that, we are going to take a 5-minute break. We will resume at 10:13. Main relevant fact, right? The main relevant fact is just that the Machaber Paskin, like the Rashba, right? That in the case of Seli in general, when it's not mipapea, right? It's netilat makom, right? That the more chumradic version of the Rashba, right? That you do netilat makom, and you're good to go. So now we are on Hay. Jacob, can you read Hay in the Shulchan Aruch?
Yeah. B'med devar ma'amurim she'ein hatzali oser ala kedei netila. Yoreh imgido v'chayotze bo. Devar k'chus she'en bo koach le'fa'pea b'chol hachaticha. So what are we talking about? That that's roasted only forbids up to netila, like the thigh with the gid and kids like that, and dvar kachus that doesn't have the strength to permeate in the whole piece. About gidi shemin shetzla'o b'chal bo, im ein b'chol hagdi shishim k'neged kol chelav shabo, asar lachol afil may roast as no. So kevan shehu shemin mefat pe'ah b'chulo. Right, so but a gedi that's the fat gedi that's roasted, it's in the fat. If it doesn't have 60 to bottle the chaylev, it's even forbidden to eat from top of the ear, because it's fat, the flavor permeates, the isser permeates. About imhu kachus, afal pisha imbo shishim kneged kol chaylev shabo, eno oser ala kedei netila. So chaylev shel behema kachusa, kachusu bit tivo, the eno fa peah. But if it's kachus, even though there isn't 60 against all the chaylev, it only issers until netila, since like there's a specific nature to kachus and it doesn't permeate. The afilu chati isar kachus tichat heter shnitzleit ima shmena isar fa pe'ah b'chula. And even if there's a kachus piece of isser and there's a chatik heter that's shmena that's roasted by it, the shaman of the heter makes the isser permeate. V'chol davar sheis lo pipuas nafal makom yedua me'achaticha b'tzali afal pishish the chaticha shishim levateli sort sorry kuntilat makom. So in anything that has this permeability or that permeates, and it falls into a place that you can recognize of the piece that's being roasted, even though there's 60 to invalidate this, or you need to do netila.
Right. So he paskins like that thing we saw the base of quote of the Rashba, right? That even when there's before and it spreads and there's 60 debates at it, we also think that there's something about it being a little bit concentrated where it first fell or originated, and you should also do Netilat Makom. Right. The relevance, of course, being that since this is considered a bit of like an extra chumrah, right? It's that like nafa makom yadua, right? If you don't know where it fell and it is like an Isser Kipua and there's shishim, we don't say it's usher from the suffix of, oh, well, maybe in that one place it was concentrated. But if you know where it fell, you should do Netilat Makom. Okay, now read the Ramah.
B'chol mevusha below rotav apoy dino katsali b'chol davar. So any cooking without a sauce or baking, we have the law for it to be like roasting.
Right, and he's pointing out that like again, as we've seen, the idea, the big like the defining factor of bishul is this rotev, right? The idea of like sauce being able to spread things around. Yeah, like dry cooking in general is what is like that's what Seli is sort of shorthand for. Dry cooking is where we don't think there's as much of a flavor to it. And now here's the real kicker from the Ramah. V'yesh omrim.
V'yesh omrim de'enanu b'ki mikray kachush osamein. V'yesh la'asor b'chol inyan adika shishim v'afilu ika shishim tzarech netilat makom v'hachi nahug. So those that say we're not an expert on what's kachush or samein, and I think our conversation earlier might prove that we don't know how to define that. And there is to like forbid anything or everything until there's 60. And even if there is 60, you need Nutila. And that's our custom.
I feel like this is a completely unsubstantiated theory, but based off of our conversation earlier about the idea of kachush, like betivo or whatever, I wonder if a part of the motivating factor behind this psak, which if you look at the parentheses, it comes from like the smak and Hagla Cherry Dora, right? Is this like sort of discomfort with the necessary perush of like, yeah, there's something that's just kind of kachush about the fat, that like kachush animals fat is just not that fatty and doesn't spread. Like, again, personally, I am not a bucky in different fats as someone who doesn't eat meat, but that sounds not correct to me. And so I wonder if there is some sense of like, yeah, I don't know, fat is fat. If we think fat spreads, I don't know that I'm so clear as to when it's like really fatty fat that spreads and not so fatty fat that only stays concentrated, right? As opposed to being like, no, if we say fat in general is an Isser Piafua, let's just apply that across the board to when fat is the concern, right? Which leads us to the Ramah's final bit, which is B'dafka.
B'dafka b'isor chelev o she'ar isor d'shayach bo sham nunit. Aval b'isor d'lo shayach be'sham nunit v'hu b'vadai kachush eno oser rak kadei netila. And this is precisely when the isser is chelev or any isser that fat is relevant to. But if fat's not relevant to the isser and we're certain it's kachush, it's only prohibited to the extent of needing Nutila.
Right, which like this is part of what I think substantiates my theory, which is that it's like, again, it's that between different types of fat, we don't feel so confident that like they don't want to totally say there isn't actually a distinction because we see that there's a tradition of saying there is, but like we don't really know what that looks like. So we're just going to say fat is fat and fat spreads. But with non-fatty isurim, then like fine, yes, we'll still make this distinction. Yavni?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like there's two categories that we're rejecting, both between different types of fat we don't know how to distinguish, but even like the same type of fat in two different animals feels even more hard to believe that we would be able to distinguish that we'd be able to turn, like that feels like even more like a spectrum. So it's saying like, oh, the fat that's around a geed, like that's a particular type of fat. I could say, okay, that type of fat. but to say like, oh, this goat has
Right, like this goat chelef haklayot is like fatty because it's a fatty goat, but this like it feels very arbitrary, and so they're saying no, we're actually just gonna not feel confident we're distinguishing. Alan?
Right, and on the other hand, there's still a distinction being made, right? Like, I also don't eat meat. I'm not an expert, but like, who gets to decide what's a shmuel meat food and what's not, right? Like, doesn't all meat have some fat?
No, I think that the idea is like of the distinction then is of isurim that are just not fat, right? Like, so for example, an example is brought up over like chametz, chametz
Oh, okay.
is,
I
is-
think I
yeah.
thought, okay, so anything with like the slightest bit of fat falls into this.
Right, any case where the
dilemma.
iser will be part, like the fat will be part of the iser, then that falls under this whole einanu beki'in.
Great.
But when it's just not fatty iser.
Amazing. Thank you for clarifying.
Okay, so now we're gonna look at a really fun Taz about the issue that the Beit Yosef had with the Torah and his Sira. Joel, are you feeling up to reading some Taz?
I may fall asleep in the middle. Let me try it. Why not? Let's go for it.
All right,
So,
this
I'm a
is
little jet
Taz.
lagged. I apologize.
This is Taz Yud.
All right. This is the case of the Isur is Kehusha, the Heter is Shmena, and we say even then, right? It's Mefafea Bechula. So, okay, here we go. Katav Beit Yosef, Shizinamad, Mashmatsinu Ken Besiman Kufchet, Linyan Recha Milta, right? We saw this, the Afilu HaHeter Shamen, Asur Lamad Desir Le Recha Milta Hi. Vatama de Heter Azil Mefatem Le Isur Vechozer Venotem Reach Lehaheter. All right, so this is the whole theory he created, that if you say that smell is a thing, right, which we'll get into in a few weeks, that the smell from the fatty thing goes, and we've been discussing for the last hour and a half what mefatem means, but so I won't define it here. It means just to fragrance, to spice, to fatten, whatever it means there. It does something to the isur, and then it comes back and, shall we say, haunts the heter. And so that was the explanation that the Beit Yosef gave in order to not have to in a system not holding chanan b'shar isurim, to say that this is still a problem. So, which of course, as we know, the Mechaber doesn't hold chanan b'shar isurim. Okay, now the Taz kicks in. V'kasheli. Dehakatav mahari b'hagat sharidura b'din recha milta v'zel shana v'tzarich lechalek ben zeh uven had yamrinan she'ena nesar yachol lesor il b'makom she'isur atzmo yachol lech sham. Right, so we have to make the difference, because right, we have in the Mahari's comments on the sharidura, he says Recha Milta is about Recha Milta is different. He says he's there talking about Recha Milta. It's not the same kind of category as this category we have, that an Isur cannot be made to penetrate an area that it couldn't go by itself by some other force. All right, those are two different things going on there. All right. Dekan or was it Cholelech Sham? Dekan Nami Hanevila Kucha in La Pitum the Recha Shami, right? Lefisha Pitumo Lichareach Vatam Hakachushimo Ad Kam Lashino, because right there, right, with Recha, we're talking about the Recha has its own kind of physics, its own rules, right? Where the Pitum, whatever that is, right, can bring reach back and forth, but
Right.
this doesn't work for kahush things, right?
And I
Kahush
think
fat
this
doesn't.
also gets to what Rav Landis was saying about, like, with the recha, part of it is just that, like, yeah, fatty things make like they have a really strong smell, and then that smell is kind of like there's much less specific physicality to the way smells mix, I think, than to the way fats mix in pieces of meat, right? So I think it's pointing out that, like, yes, the idea of like smells going back and forth, and the sort of smell of the nevela being caught up in the smell of the fatty shkuta, like, yeah, there's something to that about this pitum, about this sort of, I still think fragrance or whatever, like perfuming is relevant there. Because like that's different than when we're talking about physical isser. Yavni?
Just to be clear, when we saw it was the Beit Yosef used this and said like this is the case, and used it as a kal v'chomer, like all the more so, and this is coming to say the Haggadah rejects that all the more so hierarchy.
Correct. And now the house is going to build on this.
Yeah. So, Shmamina, thank you. Shmamine, the ikar chumrazo, mishum rechahi, The sham loach palam behachsfara de'ina nesar behachsfara de'ina nesar yachol le'asor. Right. All right. So he says, wait a second. He says one doesn't care. One's not relevant to the other here, right? Is the svara of lo nesar yachol le'asor isn't relevant to recha, and not only that, but kevan de recha milta kaimelan b'siman kufchet de b'diavad mutar, right? And not only that, but recha milta he b'diavad we don't actually hold. Right? Even then, if you really want to go the recha route, at the end of the day, we don't actually hold that. So,
well, also, is it again like that? Like here, the implication is that b'diavad this is still asur, and if the whole ikar of this chumrah is only recha, then why would it still be asur b'diavad here? That makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. But afilu diavad deha ein kan ela isur reach. Right, and asar yachol to penetrate with make the other thing go. And then afilu benogim ze'im zeh, right? Ve'afilu hachi katav mari the enorim ken ela l'recha milta davka. All right. So the same general argument here is right. At the end of the day, just to put it bluntly, recha and this ability to make the isur go someplace it couldn't go on its own have nothing to do with each other, right? And separate them out. Okay, but he's got more. Pashut the lonika vena turkan lesor mishum recha, right? Also, the Torah, whoever mentioned recha, right? The Torah didn't mention it. What's going on here, right? Dehagam b'mlicha ken katav. B'sham lo shayach recha, right? He had the similar ruling in terms of salting, and definitely in salting, recha is not an issue, right? Salt doesn't bring up reach. So there's no way that the Torah can be dealing with recha.
Right. I suggest let's go to the asterisk v'ra'iti, right? So he's built the challenges, and he's gonna reference for some reason. He usually, this is the Bach he's about to mention. I don't know why he doesn't mention the Bach, because usually he says morichami. For whatever reason he doesn't. So v'ra'iti mitartzim.
V'ra'iti mitartzim dechan da'isur asur machmat atzmo. Arminan ifilu ima isur kachush ve'eter shamen shemolicha isur imo mehar debal korcha poletet rotev nevela. Al korcha rotev nevela. Al korcha shuman shel heter mitarev ima rotev nevela. Right. So this is he said the Bach's his answer, right? This which essentially is that even though the isur is even if it's a lean isur and the heter shamen, it's able to lead the isur with it because the rotev of the nevela is able to still exude. Right, that was essentially. In other words, it still had it in its nature to exude. It was just this thing was helping it get to the point where it could hit that essentially.
I think your possibility. There's also the nature to exude was sort of the Derech Moshe thing, right? The Bach that he's putting here is that there's a difference between like it's exuding like straight up nevela juices, right? That like there's a difference between like when it's the actual isser itself and it is like the thing that it is emitting is just nevela rotev.
Yeah. So okay. So avalakaman the Mari be'isur balua arminan afapisha otachaticha shekibla le'isur hishmena ina shuman sheba molich bliat isurima. All right, he says, but over there when we said that you can't take an isur that's balua and spread it, it's the thing that it's balua in, right? That's when it the isur is it's when the thing that absorbing the isur is shmena, right? That its shuman can't lead it, but it can do it in this case, right? Whereas the thing itself that is actually is poletet, all right? But I love this. I actually underline this. Right? This is just wrong.
Not even a little bit true.
Right. 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 He says, well, we have like set boundaries for these things. We know that when a kachush thing, right, how much does it penetrate, right, without any rotev? It goes kedei kentila. That's it. That's as far as it can go. Period. Right. Isur balua, right? Yesh lekoach lelech ad sof hachaticha hahi be'atzma, all right? Shenafal isur. Umisham ve'elach ein lo koach klal below rotev, right? And so if you have an Isur balua, it can go to the end of the piece that it is part of originally, right? On its own, right? In other words, if it's like you have a piece of meat that absorbs, let's say, chalev somehow, the chalev melts into it, that chalev in the meat, it can only go to the boundary of the meat, and that's as far as it can go. That's our rule, because it's Isur balua. That's the nature of the halachic.
We probably shouldn't use chalev because that's an Isur
Oh,
mepapea, and so it absorbs blood. It absorbs blood or something.
Yeah, blood. Of course, we had that whole thing, a sharik misharik with blood, but it absorbs chametz. Let's make it easy. It absorbs chametz, and right, the chametz can't go beyond the boundary of this piece of meat. All right.
Absorbs pasta water on Pesach.
So, but and apple peas, mamash alav, right? Even though like the two things are sitting on top of each other, right? It can't leave the boundary of the first thing that it's absorbed into. That's it. That's the rule. The imken yesh kal v'chomer, the mali isur balua, right? Sheyesh b'mkoma isur mamash shuman, afilu hachi ein mo'il latet koach le'isur hanifla shetzachutz ligvulo. Right, so we have on one case, even if this Isur is absorbed something really fatty, it's still limited to the boundaries of the things it's absorbed in. Right, kol sheken the Isur mishat nitzad shmo nitzadat smo shegvulo lesor ad kidei klipa bechatichat eter vetulo. Right, shelo yo'ilo shuman shel chatichat eter lo sichutz ligvulo. Right, the kachli chutz ligvul shel achar haklipa beisur mitzad hasmo kamo bechutz ligvul bechol hachaticha she'etzel chaticha shenesra machmat liat isur. So it's the same thing, right? If you have a limit of kedei klipa that this isur kachush can go, right? And that's it. It's stuck. It can't go any further than its laws of nature, shall we say? It's physics in this, and that's it. All the more so for this.
Right. It's a really smart argument, right? He's like pointing out, he's like, okay, if a fatty piece of permissive meat absorbs this pasta water on Pesach, right? Even though it's a fatty piece of meat that has absorbed this, right? We say the pasta water could only go to the edges of that meat, right? Even though it's now actually like directly mixing with the fat that is like something that's mepapea, we say that chametz, thing can't spread to anything, even if it's touching another piece. So we're like, if you have an Isur kachush that below rotev can't go at all, like there's nothing in the piece itself where the Isur resides that's at all like mepapea, and it can't go beyond a klipa, suddenly some other piece outside of it having fat is going to make that able to spread in a way that the fat that the Isur is absorbed in isn't able to spread something. Right, it's a very smart argument. So he has a big issue with this.
I mean, the argument against him is action at a distance, but that's okay. He can. It does happen.
Yeah. So let's skip to you see where Ela vadai davar zeh hu en lo yisod.
Let's see.
After a period. Like if you're in the Shir Devorah, it's 5 lines down in the wide lines.
Let's see. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that what you wanted?
The Ela vadai davar zeh, but yeah. The beginning of that line. Ela vadai davar zeh hu en lo yisod v'ikar klal.
I have a different Shirat Devorah than you do. So give me 1 second. You're skipping the seer part. Is that what you're skipping?
Yes.
Here we go. Ela vadai davar zeh. I have it. Does everyone else have it? I was slow to it. So all right, good. Ela vadai davar zeh hu ein lo yisod v'ikar klal umibli iyun amru ken. Right, it's just like really harsh, right? V'divrei haTorah tmuim hem kamo shekatav Beit Yosef, right? So all right, everyone's wrong up till here, and the Torah is just like confusing. But here we go. Ilule demistafina lehagia hayiti magia b'divrei haTorah b'lshon zeh. If I wasn't so afraid to correct the Torah, here's how I would correct it, right? Clearly ta'ut, right? Ela afilu chatichat. So here's the language he's adding. Ela afilu chatichat isur shmeina v'chatichat heter kechusha b'chulei. Right. So even if the chatichat isur shmeina and the chatichat heter is kechusha, right, then that would be mefafeh. Hachi kamar. So what's he saying here? Lumi by b'chaticha achat sheyesh ba'atzma chelev. Right. Dehainu keshahid keahid digdi shetzlo b'chabo. Shizachar lamala. So in other words, not only the obvious case here is when you have a chaticha on its own that has fatty stuff in it, that the fat goes everywhere, like the gedi that all the way to its ozen, right? The fat spreads, right, that we had in the Gemara. Ela afilu im yesh shnei chatichot, echad isur ve'echad heter, ve'oto shel isur shamen, v'mefafeh isur b'chol heter, right? So what's the chiddush, right? Here is that the Torah is trying to bring is that it's not just one piece by itself that has fat that goes all over when you roast it, when you sli, but when you have two pieces together that are roasting, and one of them is fat, and the fatty one's the isur one. There, the fat can go beyond the boundary of the piece itself into the next piece. That's the great thing that the tourist should have been saying, according to him, right?
Right,
so.
but the next bit is just him doing like a nice like duk. But right, his main thing is he's like, yeah, Mr. Fina, okay, I'm not going to technically say this, but I am going to say this. I am going to say this is really what the Torah meant. And even if it isn't what he meant, then he was wrong, basically, right? But like, the Taz feels completely confident that this deen of if there's a chaticha kachush of iser and the heter shmena, it just, no, it does not usher the entire piece. He just thinks that's incorrect. Maybe the Torah, like we have an incorrect girsa, but it's just wrong. And again, it's very smartly argued. Major shkoyach Joel on reading that after a cross-continental flight.
Thanks. Just to ask once more, in case other people are confused about, I've now internalized the Taz. Can you say out the difference between the Taz and the Taz's reading of the Torah and what the Torah had originally said?
Right. So the Torah, the girsa that we have, and that everyone seems to in fact have, is where the Torah says, if you have a piece of lean iser and a piece of fatty heter that are roasted together, then actually the heter does become entirely usher unless there is shishim opposite the iser, right? Because of this whole fat going back and forth, spreading, et cetera, right? And what the Taz says the Torah should have said is that if the iser is shmena and the heter, there's a separate piece of heter, then yes, the iser can be mifafea in the entirety of this separate piece, as opposed to only within one individual piece. But that if the iser is kachush, it cannot spread to the entirety of another piece of heter, even if that heter is fatty.
Right, but doesn't that go against what Taj just said of the idea that if an iser has a gavul, right, like it can only spread to a certain extent, and the chiddush is that actually in this special case that it can spread beyond the gavul.
Well, but no, the whole point is that he just doesn't think he doesn't think that chiddush exists, right? That he thinks the only place that chiddush exists is with reicha. Right, the only scenario in which the idea of like an iser kachush and the heter shaman can like make something usher is vis-a-vis reicha milta, right? That there we have the sort of interaction of the smells and the whatever that we do think that can make something lichatchila usher, right? But he says the only way that only applies to reicha, and reicha is b'diavad mutar according to the way that we end up paskening. Right, that he says physically it does have a gvul. I stand by that. There isn't a chiddush that in this case it doesn't. Physically it does have a gvul, and when the iser itself is like when it's a kachush piece of iser, it cannot entirely oser a piece of heter b'tzeli. Yeah, Rav Joel.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, Lexie, like, because I think what he's saying is, and what are the rules for an isur that is that has that's mefafea, that's shamen? Its rules are not only going to go through its entire gvul, but it can go beyond its gvul, right? It has no boundary essentially as long as it's touching. So,
right, that Isser, and this is what we get in general, and this will come up in Zayin, right, that the Isser Shaman can just go absolutely everywhere. But when the Isser is Kahush, he rejects the idea basically that it can interact physically with a Heter Shaman and make something super Asr. That's the Taz's main psak. Okay. So let's go on. Aaron, can you read Vav in the Shulchan Aruch?
דבר שיש לו פיפוע בצלי, אם היה אחד חם ואחד צונן, התחתון גובר. So if there's some sort of thing that has pipua, we're talking about a case of selling. If one of whichever one is on the Tatagavar, whichever one is, yeah. לפיכך, אם נפל חם על צונן, אינו אוסר אלא כדי קליפה. ואם נפל צונן על חם, אם אין בהתר שישים כנגד האיסור, הכל אסור. If we have a hot thing falling onto a cold thing, then it's just Kedei Klipa. If a cold thing fell into a hot thing, you need Shishim to do Beetle. The rest of the whole thing is Asr.
Right. So the Vav is pretty straightforward. It's just that Tata Gavar applies to Seli as well. Can you keep reading in Zayin?
The Chatichat Isur Oseret Chaberta Benigiata, Davka Isura Mechimat Atzma, Kegun Nevela or Basar Bachalav. Aval in Amba Isur El Mashabalam Makomacher, in Oseret Acherd Hanogat Ba. So when a chaticha, the case in which a chaticha is able to be oser another chaticha is when the chatichat isur is aser mechimat atzma. B'med dvarim amrim, k'shebal'a isur she'eino mefafeh. Aval bal'a min hadvarim shemafapim. B'tiv'an kagon shuman oseret chaverta ben b'tzali ben b'nogad zo v'zo cham v'cham. O b'tachton chama v'elyon tzonnet. She'isra below b'atzma mefapeh v'yotzem chaticha l'chaticha. So when we say that it has to be aser mechimat atzma, what we're talking about is, or when we're saying an isra balua does not work to be oser, what we mean is an isra balua that is not mefapeh. Therefore, an isra that is mefapeh, even if it's balua, is able to oser another chaticha under the same conditions, i.e. either they're both hot or the lower one is hot. Continue with their mouth.
Yeah.
Haga, for kolza b'shtei chatichot, aval klisha bala isur, osa heter shenogebo afil be'isur she'eno shamen. This is about chatichot, but you shouldn't make an analogy between this and kalim. When it comes to a kli that is absorbed in isur is able to be oser if chaticha or anything heter, even if it's not an isur balua that's mfapeh.
Right. So kalim, and there's a nice Taz looking at that briefly explaining why that distinction is, but they don't have the same goal. We do not have the time to look at a massive shach on this, but I want to just summarize because he makes an interesting point. So right, going back to this idea of the Isser Balua, right? It did, like in the Mechaber, he distinguishes between Isura Mechamat Atzma, Kigon Nevela Ubasar Bechalav, right? And he gives the Basar Bechalav as the example of something that's Aser Mechamat Atzma. Right, and we saw that come up with Chatichar Elitz Kabed, right? The idea that like Basar B'chalav is not considered like an Isser Balua. It does like something, a piece of Basar that's like a nice sized steak that's absorbed Chalav and become Basar B'chalav is considered a Chatichar Elitz Kabed, because it like that is the Isur Atzma, the combination of the meat and the dairy is what makes the Isser. But the Maharshal and the Rashba seem to disagree about this case of Basar B'chalav, a thing that has been naseh Basar B'chalav, being able to usher something else just with its touch, right? The Rashal actually doesn't think chalav, not chalev, but chalav does not have piyapua, right? Chalav is not considered something that spreads around. And so he says, no, like a piece of basar v'chala, would just like bitzeli, doesn't oser something next to it other than kedei klipa, right?
Even if the beef is fatty.
If the beef was fatty, I think it would. But I think if the beef was not fatty, then
We don't.
no.
Wait,
I
but
think even if the meat is fatty,
Mhm.
because we always hold that all meat is maybe fatty.
Right, yeah. So again, well, according to the Maharshal, yes. Right. So even if the meat is fatty, it would only seemingly oser something it touched kedei klipa.
because the fat itself is not the isul, it's the fat in combination with the milk that's isul, right?
Correct.
Right.
And we don't think that is able to spread in the same way, at least according to a number of the Rishonim.
It's almost like you, as the fat spreads and the milk doesn't, you've unbussered bachala this meat. You've taken the fat, it exudes out of this mixture without the milk, so it becomes kosher again. Which is a shocking idea.
Right. So
Because
this is how, yeah, no, it is like pretty astonishing, especially given the generally like very machmir ways that we relate to the basar v'chalav. But here, we're at least some of the poskim are not being so chomerdik about it, right? And so that's how, and the Taz ends up going like the Maharshal. The Shach says, no, this still can be oser. The difference is that, and he makes a very smart distinction. He says, okay, and he's like, and I think the Ramah agrees with me. The difference is that when we say ein anu b'ki'in, and we don't distinguish between kachush and shamen, that's only when we're dealing with isur atzma, right? But like with something balua, we're not going to extend that chumrah so far, right? And keep saying everything's always fatty, and like that keeps extending. So he's saying here, as in the Taz and things like that would believe it doesn't oser something it touches without rotev at all, like stam. The Shach thinks that it's oser, I believe it's either kedei klipa or kedei netila, right? That he thinks that like after a certain point with balua, we do say we're biki'in enough to distinguish, but not to the point of saying, oh, this basar b'chalav wouldn't usher a thing it touched even the slightest bit, right? He says no, it would be like kedei klipa or kedei netila. So that's this very massive shach here. It's very smart. Recommend looking at it, but we will not have time if we want to finish this up today. Rav Joel, did you have something to say? No.
I think doesn't someone make the distinction between when it's basar that absorbs gavina versus absorbs chalav? Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, maybe I just didn't see it. The main point is that people like the Maharshal, whatever, have to explain what's being said here of when it says the isur atzma, of it's talking about a piece of basar and a piece of gavina touching each other, as opposed to a piece of basar that has absorbed milk and become basar b'chala. Right, they have
the
to say
reason
what
why
it
that has
says.
to be gvina is because you need a solid, because otherwise you have the rotev if it's
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. So that's the distinction that ends up being made there. Okay, and then the Taz on the Kli, I'm just gonna like, if you look at Taz on the Tet Zayin, right? So this is on the Ramah's point that the whole distinguishing between a balua iser that's mifafea and that's not only applies to foods, but not to kelim. He says, Hatam bezeh, didafka ma'achal sheyesh lo ma liflot megufo, as balia ena holechet bilo rotev. Aval kli she'en ba plita megufa, as yotzei shapir masha bala. He's like, yeah, like something that has other like flavor and substance in it, then we don't think the iser is expelled so easily if it's an absorbed iser. But a kli has nothing else to expel. It only has this thing that it absorbed. So that is expelled more easily, whether it's iser mipapea or not. Lefiza pashut the kli ein sar ma'achal shebalua bo isor she'eno mipapea. Kigon kabed u basar shenimlach b'kli she'eno menukav. Okay, right. So he just basically explains the idea of the distinction we're making between the between the kli and the rest of the foods. The last note I'll make on the siman is that with the chetz, the bit of the kulia, right, that the mechaber paskins, again, like the Torah did, which is that the kulia shetzalo bechalvo eno oser el kedei klipa, because of this membrane that is mafsik. But the Rama says, actually, no, that's usher, because there's two different potential reasons people give. One is suggesting the Gemara doesn't believe in the kulia answer, right? One is saying the Gemara rejected that teirutz when it said the kachush thing, right? This just isn't true. And the other is maybe we're worried the chrome might like break, and then it'll just like all the fat will come in and usher everything. Aaron?
Just to clarify the second part of the Taz is saying that a kli itself is not necessar from an isser, something that is usher mechemat, not mechemat atzmo, unless the thing is that it's nivla is an isser mefafer.
Right, that if there's something like if without rotev, like a piece of isser that a piece of food that absorbed isser that is not mefafer falls onto a kli, right, and there's no rotev, the kli isn't rotev. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Alan?
It's a bit of a rabbit hole, so I will hold on.
Okay. Well, in our last 7 minutes, I suggest that we bravely push forward, and Sarah sadly is not feeling well today, but there's a lot of material to cover on Malicha next class. So I want us to take a glance at some of the sources she sent out, especially some of the Gemaras. So can people pull up the sheet that she sent out? We're gonna take a look at this sugya in Chulin Farizayin Amud Bet. Give me a thumbs up when you have it up. Okay. Yavni, can you read from Chulin? The Hanhu Atmata. Yavni, you're on mute.
Sorry. הנאו התמהתה דאמליכו בריש גלותה בגידה נשה רבינה עשה רב אחא ברב אשי שרי. So there was a case of thighs that were salted in the house of the Exilarch, is that what it's called? With the Gida Nashe still in it. Ravina said it's asur, and Rav Acha bar Rav Ashi said it's permitted. Atu shailu alamar bar Rav Ashi amar lehu Abba Share. So they went and asked the son of Rav Ashi, so I guess the brother of Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ashi, and he said he confirmed his brother's opinion in saying that their father would permit it. Amar le Rav Acha bar Rav leRavina, mai datech? Da'amar Shmuel maliach harehu karoteach kavush harehu kamavusal. So Rav Acha bar Rav, who permits it, asked Ravina, who forbids it, what is your opinion based? What is your opinion based on? Is it because that Shmuel said maliach is like salting is like heat, presumably dry heat, and pickling is like cooking? והאמר שמואל לא שנו אלא שנתבשל בה, אבל ניצלה בה קולף ואוכל עד שמגיע לגיד. But didn't Shmuel himself say that the Mishnah did not forbid the Mishnah that we looked at that said that Gida Nashe is benoten tam, that doesn't apply, that only applies for cooking and not for roasting. And in the case of roasting, you can eat until you get to the Gid itself. And
salting is
salt
roasting.
is like roasting specifically, I guess.
Right, because he's about to explain why.
וכי מהי כרותח, דקאמר כרותח דמבושל, והמי דקאמר כבוש הרי כמבשל, מכלל דרותח דצלי כאמר. And if you would say, what did it mean by roteach, this hot thing that the salting is like heat? If you would say that it's like the heat of cooking, but the next line, the next statement is that pickling is like bishul, is like mevushal, and so it must mean that if it's using this word roteach for the salting and mevushal for the pickling, it must mean that there's a distinction between them, and therefore the pickling is like cooking with sauce, and the salting is like the heat of the heat that the salting is like is the heat of roasting.
Right. So this
Gotcha.
Gemara is just where we get, yes, like Kasha and Ravina, we end up with yes, Malicha is like Sliach. Whether they are fully comparable or not will be a debate amongst Rishonim, but in general, we say at least to some extent, those paradigms are comparable. So now we'll look at the Ran. I'm going to read these for the sake of time. We have Hanu Atmata di Imlecha Berish Galuta, Begidat Mashia, Ravina Asar. The Savar de Maleach Mavushal, Yasar Lahu, Mishum, Shamno Shogid, Klosh Em Basar Shishim, Udivrei Mesh Omer de Letzeli, Umalicha, Lomisharin Bashishim, Becholinyan Asar Lahu. Right. So again, he's explaining that Ravina's opinion is in general that he believed it was like Mavushal, right? That he believes Malicha is comparable to our cooking with Rotev, and that it would be Asar unless you had 60. But the crucial bit, since we don't hold like Ravina, is the next bit. Rav Achashari, Spirale de Maleach Harehu Kroteach Tetzeli, Ubeklipa, Ubenetilat Makom Sagi. Right, so he thinks it's like roasting, and so either with a klipa or the slightly larger Netilat Makom, it would be permitted. V'chi tema, v'chi have Kroteach Tetzeli, my have, nema de Mepapea, because Amrin on the aisle, the Chele Mepapea Afilu Tetzeli. Yesh lomar delo adiv shomen de gid hanasha mechelef kachush the amrinan aisle de lo mepapea the kamosha katabti lamala. Right, and if you were to say like v'chi havek roteach tzeli, right, like what does it mean that it's like the roteach tzeli? If we say that it's like we're talking about the case of mepapea, something that fully spreads, as we talked about earlier with chelev that spreads everywhere. Even in the case of roasting, like you could say that, like, okay, the shomen of the gid is not stronger than the lean chelev, which we said earlier is not fully spread, right? Like you might have thought, oh, well, the shomen shel gid, maybe that's like the more chomerdic version of tzeli. No, we say ultimately that shouldn't be more stringent than generally lean fat, which we say doesn't fully spread. It's only oser kadei klipa kadei netzila. V'Ramban zel teret b'molicha afilu chalev shamen eno papea v'afal gav d'amrinan d'maleach ahariku kroteach b'tzeli haynu la'afuke meroteach d'mevushal aval lahamilta garia metzeli d'afal gav d'chalev b'tzeli mepapea b'molicha eno mepapea. So the Ramban thinks melicha is particularly mekil, right? He says even though chalev fully spreads and you need shishim in the case of roasting, in the case of salting, you don't even need shishim, right? Even with chalev, you would only need kadei klipa or kadei netila, because actually when it says it's karoteach, that's only to distinguish it from mevushal, right? That's only to make it considered more mekil, but not to say it's completely equivalent to tzeli. But the Rashba doesn't like this. Rashba is al cholek b'davar. To give under Ravina spirale de maleach karoteach mevushal the adif mitzeli. Heisli name aladidan de gari mine. He's like, okay, since there at least one of the opinions here was that maliach would be equivalent to like bishul, which is stronger than tzeli, how are we here to say that malicha is actually weaker than tzeli, right? That seems like too far of a jump, right? Ella vadai mashma de cold mefavei batzeli mefavei malicha. Ukadibri harav Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Aderet zal nirali, right? The Ran thinks the Rashba makes sense. He just gives another example to support this. But basically, the Rashba thinks Malicha and Tzeli are fully equal paradigms, right? We'll see the Rashba basically thinks that Malicha and Tzeli pretty much entirely map onto one another. And the Ran seems to agree with him. It is now 11:01, so I don't want to keep you guys hostage. Thank you for, thank you all for this year. And yeah, next week we'll get to pick up with some more salting with
before you go, if you want to stay up late at night and not be able to go to sleep, the great illustration cinematically of what does it look for a fatty substance to be mefafea is the late 1950s movie, The Blob, that devoured everything. And it's not just the whole cities, but look how it goes through heating units to come into your room when you least expect it. It's a persistent, it's a good illustration. Only if you're strong enough and daring enough. Anyway, Lexie, Yeshkach.
That's a very wonderful share.
Lexie.
Michael, Jessica, good to see you back in Boston.
Thank you.